Hello and welcome back to BerlinsideOut, a foreign affairs podcast in association with the German Council on Foreign Relations that takes an expert look at how Germany sees the world and the world sees Germany. Welcome back in particular to the first episode of our second season. I'm Benjamin Tallis, Senior Research Fellow here at the Council and head of its action group Zeitenwende, and I'm here with my friend and co-host Aaron Gash-Burnett, a journalist and political analyst of German politics. Aaron, hard to believe we're here already with season 2, and we're marking it today with some very special friends of the podcast, aren't we?
We are indeed, Ben. Welcome and thank you to our listeners as we kick off season 2. I'm very excited to get to a new phase of these necessary discussions in German foreign policy with this second season. We're going to be giving you a bit of a sneak peek at what we'll be looking at this season a little later in the show. But first, it's been an eventful few weeks in German foreign policy. Even since we wrapped up season 1 in early February, we saw Chancellor Olaf Scholz mark the 2-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the 2-year anniversary of his Zeitenwende speech, the sea change in German foreign policy that we were supposed to be seeing, with steadfast refusals to deliver Taurus long-range cruise missiles, which would allow Ukraine to hit targets that it can't hit yet on the supposed grounds, Scholz said, that it would involve German soldiers needing to be in Ukraine and making Germany a party to the war.
Yes, Aaron, but of course that's been revealed to be an excuse rather than anything to do with reality, because the British and the French didn't become parties to the war by sending Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles to Ukraine. So it's incorrect, but also it seems to be foolish or pointless as a distinction, really, because Vladimir Putin certainly considers Germany to be a party to the war anyway. He's been extremely clear that Russia is at war with the West. Not just because they are backing Russia's enemies, but because they are Russia's enemies. And this, we have to take seriously this kind of language from Vladimir Putin. So the consistent refusal to send Taurus long-range cruise missiles is one thing that has really irritated many, many allies, as well as Olaf Scholz's coalition partners. But it's only got worse in the few days since we recorded this episode, with the leak from the Bundeswehr officers, the Luftwaffe officers discussing Taurus, revealing how little planning there had actually been in going into even considering this possibility, but also further revealing details of how allies go about their business, and again showing Germany's intransigence, or the Scholz Chancellery's intransigence, when it comes to really doing what's needed to step up and support Ukraine. And that, of course, cumulatively led the former British Defence Minister, Ben Wallace, to deliver a memorable quote along those lines when he said that Olaf Scholz is the wrong man in the wrong job at the wrong time. And that's an evaluation increasingly shared, I think, around Europe. And it's been compounded further, just when you thought this couldn't get worse, it's been compounded further by the switch to so-called peace rhetoric from Olaf Scholz and the SPD, which seems to be a strategic decision and one that is not welcomed by allies either, because it actually puts Germany in the position of continuing to signal yet more weakness at a time when strength and resolve is what we should be projecting. And it seems to diverge from the kind of rhetoric coming from allies such as Emmanuel Macron's France or the Baltic states and other key allies around Europe. So this is creating a very difficult time for Germany because of this consistent policy from the Chancellery.
And also is clearly isolating Germany from its allies as well. I mean, Emmanuel Macron rebuked Olaf Scholz in public. He said, that 2 years ago, some of us, meaning Germany, of course, were talking about sending helmets. And then he, of course, talked about Olaf Scholz's continuous MO, where he refuses and refuses and refuses. And it happens anyway, which we saw over Leopards, and we even might hope that we will see with Taurus, because it means that the pattern will repeat and Taurus will eventually be sent, even if it's late and short. But also we saw British MPs, influential British MPs, who also accused Olaf Scholz of recklessness, because he implied that for Storm Shadow to be used by the Ukrainians, that British forces would need to be in the ground on Ukraine. And so now we are seeing even Germany's British allies decry Olaf Scholz as being irresponsible.
That's right. And I think it was very telling that Ben Wallace, to mention him again, said that Germany has dragged its feet over every one of these important decisions. Emmanuel Macron said those who are now saying never, never for Taurus were exactly the ones saying never, never for the Leopards, never, never for the Marder IFVs, etc., etc. Although I have to say from the analysis that I'm doing, it does seem to be different this time. This seems to be a line in the sand that Olaf Scholz has drawn and actually backed himself into a corner by doing so. It seems to have become politically very difficult for Olaf Scholz to backtrack on Taurus now. And so the focus is turning to Olaf Scholz's coalition partners. How long will the Greens and the Free Democrats, the Liberals, actually allow this to continue when they see it as being against Germany's vital national interest?
And so, Ben, on that topic, as well as others, that is a question that we have asked two of our guests this week. We are joined first today by a very, very, very special guest and friend of BerlinsideOut and a member of the action group Zeitenwende that you head up here at the Council.
Yes, Aaron, that's right. We're very pleased to welcome Anton Hofreiter to the show. He's the chair of the Europe Committee in the German Bundestag and member of parliament representing Bavaria for the Greens. Tony, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's really a big problem. Of course, Taurus is not a single one weapon which would be a game changer, but everybody who is in favor of delivering Taurus never mentioned this. That was always the argument from Scholz. You think it's a game changer? No, we don't think it's a game changer. Ukraine needs much more than Taurus. It needs much more ammunition. It needs airplanes. It needs more air defense. It needs more armored vehicles, also more battle tanks, but Taurus would help. And the arguments why we should not deliver Taurus are, when it comes to the technical aspect, false. They are just not true, because Taurus is a very modern cruise missile. And if we really don't trust Ukraine, which there is no signs that we can trust them, because so far they accepted all conditions we put on the use of Western weapons. But even if we still don't trust them, you could Taurus geofence. Taurus could be geofence before we deliver to them. That does not mean we have to program it what they can hit, but it means that we can deliver them in a condition that they are unable to attack any Russian territory, and it's nearly impossible if you are not the producer of it to change this. So his cause is false, and of course it's false that we need German soldiers in Ukraine on the ground. You don't have to understand many technical details. There's just one thing you have to know. Southern Korea has more than 200 of Taurus, and of course, they would not wait for German soldiers to use them. You just have, as always, to explain the soldiers of the army how to use them, as we have explained it to Southern Korea or to Spain, which also has some Taurus, and it would be exactly the same to Ukraine. So the excuses of Scholz not to deliver are not correct. But even the bigger problem, the not delivering of Taurus, are the kind of excuses, because they are signaling in the direction of Putin, we are weak. And it's because of the misconception of Scholz and the Social Democrats how to deal with Putin. They still believe we could just deal with Putin. But that's not true. He's a classical dictator, and a classical dictator which has really a very sensitivity for weakness. And every time he detects weakness, he attacks. So it's a big problem that we again and again, with we, I mean Germany, or more precisely Scholz, that we signaling weakness, because it's not avoiding to be part of the war, which he may think he is doing with this pass, but to make Putin more aggressive and to end up with a bigger risk that Putin attacks more countries, the risk becomes higher that NATO soldiers are directly involved.
Absolutely, and that our citizens are directly involved, that we are more directly under threat. And this is what many of Germany's allies seem to have realized. And as what we've codenamed Operation Unblock Olaf, which seems to have been unleashed by Emmanuel Macron and others in coordination, because they've recognized also where the problem lies. It's clear that Germany has done a lot, but it's also clear that Germany is key to the defense of Europe in future, key to our deterrence, as you mentioned. And it's all too clear that Germany's signaling weakness and not stepping up because Olaf Scholz does not want Ukraine to win. So whatever the excuse is for not delivering Taurus, much as the excuses for not delivering Leopards last year, there is a reason behind it, and that's now what allies are trying to change. What are the coalition partners and other parties in Germany doing to try and change that, or what can they do?
We try to put pressure on it, but the problem is that also the Christian Democratic Union and the Christian Social Union are not really coordinated. So the coalition in a kind of way is blocked because the different analysis of the situation, Social Democrats on one side, Liberals and Greens on the other side, and the Union, as a big opposition, not party but fraction, is blocked because there's in reality two different parties between Christian Democratic Union and Christian Social Union. That's a really big problem. And we try to speak out loudly, also public, to put on pressure. But it's not easy because we have here two different strategies. The one strategy is Ukraine must win. The other strategy is Russia may not win. It sounds in the first aspect we only some differences in words, but it's a total different strategy. If you have the strategy, Ukraine must win, then you deliver everything what is needed that Ukraine can liberate the occupied territories. If you say only Russia must not win, you only deliver as much that Ukraine does not collapse. And the effect of this is that the war goes on and goes on and goes on because Putin is convinced that in the long run, he has a better chance to win military because his dictatorial system is superior to the democratic system.
Let's talk about Taurus for a minute. As you have said at the beginning of the show, we don't think that this is the only thing that we need to be delivering. We need to be stepping up our support to Ukraine in all sorts of ways. But it does seem that this is a particular weapon that really seems to be on Olaf Scholz's mind and in his imagination for what might escalate the conflict. But why is Olaf Scholz being so stubborn with Taurus? Is Taurus optional? Because he seems to think that it is, and that German support for Ukraine is solid without it.
Yeah, Taurus is really important because with Taurus, you can attack back in the front line, logistics, ammunition depots, and a lot of more things. And Taurus is much better than Storm Shadows because Taurus don't need GPS signaling. So you cannot bring him down with electronic warfare. And then it has the special possibility to penetrate deep inside with Taurus before it explodes. So you can destroy really well protected ammunition sites, which would make a big difference for Ukraine, because Ukraine has a big problem with ammunition, and especially Russia has much more artillery ammunition. But with Taurus, you could destroy a lot of these logistic points, even if they are very well protected. And why Scholz is especially afraid of delivering Taurus, I only can speculate. I don't know it, because it's exactly the same arguments he brought forward when it came to Leopard 2, nothing of his concerns realized after we have delivered Leopard. It just happened. We delivered them, and Putin and Russia did nothing.
This is the story of the war. We heard about, the Marder was going to have devastating escalatory potential. Then the Leopard would have this potential. Now the Taurus. It's this menagerie of false fears, none of which has come true. So we would like to keep pushing on that and get further towards the real reasons. And I think it's essential that not only allies, but also actors within Germany keep up the pressure to understand why this is the case and why actually the Chancellor is acting against European security. You mentioned ammunition is a key issue for Ukraine at the moment. And while Taurus would be a key weapon that would allow Ukraine to move to active defense in 2025 to keep pinning the Russians back and make sure they can hold the line, ammunition will be key in that fight too. Yet at the moment, we know that a lot of ammunition produced in Germany is being sent outside of the European Union and being sent not to Ukraine, but to other countries, even though Ukraine is a priority. Is this not something that the government should be doing something about to actually reprioritize where our limited capacity to produce ammunition is actually then directed to?
I think that's a really important point, because our military industry is producing more and more, and Ukraine so far is not prioritized enough. People say, okay, it's private companies and say just deliver them, but it's of a really crucial security interest for us. And I interpret our laws in this way, that because of it's in our own security interest, we could force the companies to deliver some priority to Ukraine, but government has to act for this. And that's the next important point where we have to push, because it's not so publicly discussed so far as the Taurus issue, but it's also a very, very important issue where we have to push that everything what is produced has to be prioritized for the security of Europe and Germany, and that in the moment means it has to be delivered to Ukraine.
We're also joined today by Thomas Erndl, a member of the German Bundestag for the CSU, vice chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Bundestag. Thomas, servus, good afternoon to you. And we're very interested to hear your thoughts on the statements of the last couple of days from Chancellor Olaf Scholz about Taurus, these excuses that have been given and dismantled by partners and allies, and where that leaves Germany's strategic positioning and its credibility.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. Thanks for having me. It was really tough and absurd to hear the statement of Chancellor Scholz. Beginning of this week, we were pushing for Taurus, as we were pushing for other weapon systems in the past, heavily in the last couple of months. And I really don't understand why it's not possible to deliver them. Of course, Taurus is not a game changer, but it's an important system. And I think there is no way in keeping that away from Ukraine, because every single mosaic piece is necessary to help Ukraine win back their territories. And therefore, even if we have a pushback from the Chancellor's side, we continue pushing. And of course, we as opposition need to confront Chancellor Scholz also with the reality, or with the way we basically see it. And the statement from Scholz is not true to our knowledge. There are no German soldiers needed on Ukrainian soil to operate Taurus. There is no reason why we cannot train them as we did with all the other weapon systems. And this happens already on European soil for the last 1.5 years. And therefore, yeah, again, there is no reason. And actually, the position of Scholz is also a sort of threat to us, because he is somehow influenced by Russian threats, and that is not what we actually need. We need to act independently. We need to act from a position of strength. We cannot allow to have our position aligned to what Russia is doing. Of course, there need to be a careful thinking of what are the next steps. But in this case, it's really visible that there is some Russian influence, or he is basically influenced by Russian pressure or threats, and that is, of course, a security concern for all over Europe.
Yes, absolutely. Very much Russia is setting the agenda rather than Scholz actually getting out there and Europeans getting out there and setting this proactive agenda to defend our societies. Do you think Germans are aware of why this is so important? Or perhaps you could say why you think this is so important for Germans, that we do take these steps for Ukraine to actually be able to win the war?
Honestly, we are also attacked by Russia in several ways. So they try to destabilize our society by heavily pushing fake information, disinformation into our society. We are attacked, our companies are attacked with cyber attacks every day. So we are already a target. Europe is already a target. So we need to be aware that there is no way in negotiating a deal. So we need to act from a position of strength. And this is also what we need to communicate to our people, to our society. We can also not allow that somebody is successful with such an aggression. We don't want to have the right of the stronger country. We want to keep on with our rule of law system, with the international law. This is what made us successful in the past. This is what helps us being successful on the global market. And this is what allowed us to live in freedom and peace for the last 7 decades. And this is what we need to make sure is maintained in the future. And therefore, we cannot allow that for Russia. We cannot provide that signal that you're successful with such a aggression. We cannot allow that signal to others like Iran, North Korea, etc. So there are many reasons, I think, why we cannot allow that and how we can explain that to the German public and the German society.
Yes, absolutely. That's it. It's the future of our freedom that is also at stake. And the route to securing ourselves runs through Ukraine at the moment. But as you mentioned, Taurus is only one part of this puzzle. It's only one piece in the puzzle. There are other things we could be doing. One suggestion for that has been to reprioritize the massive amounts of ammunition production that we see in the European Union, which are currently being produced with our limited capacity, but are being sent outside the EU to third countries, not even to Ukraine or to our own stocks. Is that something the government should be reprioritizing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we lost anyway 2 years. We were not in the mode acting as it's necessary. We only started increasing our production capacity for ammunition in these days and months, and that is absolutely too late. So we need to see now really what we can do on a short-term period. And this is, for instance, as you mentioned, reprioritizing. This is also buying on the global market. I can understand that we, of course, should try to increase our value creation in Europe, but we don't have time anymore. So there is no time left, and therefore we need to make sure that we do everything which helps Ukraine on a day-by-day basis, and every day is important. And every day where we are discussing and debating is lost, and therefore buy on the global market, reprioritize what we produce in Europe, and make sure we gather everything together which helps Ukraine.
Does that include the seizure of Russian assets as well?
Yes, that would include that as well. I think the Russian assets should be fully utilized for the reconstruction, but also for the, in my view, support of Ukraine on every level, financially, militarily. And I really don't understand why we can seize the interest and not the actual asset itself. Because at that point in time, at that day, the interest is paid, it's part of the asset.
What you have said just now, both on upping production for ammunition, Taurus, seizing assets, has a lot more in common, at least privately, with some of the parliamentarians within the coalition. But they have voted against, for example, the CDU-CSU motion, most recent one on Taurus delivery. What do you think some of these parliamentarians within the governing coalition parties should be asking themselves?
Well, they are in a difficult situation. They have the stability of the government in mind on one hand. On the other hand, they have in mind, of course, the support for Ukraine. In the end, it's a government decision, but of course, it's important to have the backing of the parliament. And we had that really with a vast majority when we started delivering heavy weapons. We had a big debate in the beginning whether we should deliver heavy weapons or not. We made that clear from a parliament point of view, had really a vast majority, big support for the government, and from that, the government started delivering it. And with Taurus, this could be happening in the same way. So we need a signal from the parliament, and I think we have a large majority supporting that. And with that basis, the government could act. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't see the point. And well, it's in the end the decision of the chancellor. And if he is not deciding in that way, then it's also difficult for the colleagues in the coalition. I heard that they got a lot of pressure also from the Chancellery to make sure that they don't send a signal of instability of the coalition, that they send the signal we are together, we are still working in that coalition, and that is a wrong signal, and it was a bad day for Ukraine. We keep on pushing, and I hope we can win further parliamentarians supporting our motions going forward. And we just don't give up, because it's not winning as a party or as a parliamentary group. It's supporting Ukraine with what they desperately need.
Exactly. And this goes far beyond party politics. It goes to national security and European security for exactly the reasons you mentioned earlier. Very, very clear message there, Thomas Erndl. Thank you very much indeed. And I hope this gives hope to Germany's allies outside, who see that the opinion of the Chancellor is not the only opinion, even if it's the one that is actually determining German policy at the moment. But it's thus clear also where the obstacles to Germany doing more lie. They do not lie, as we heard earlier, with various MPs from the coalition or the opposition.
Thank you very much to both Anton Hofreiter and Thomas Erndl for joining us on the show. Let's bring in this week's panelists to help us unpack what they said. First up, we're very happy to welcome back someone who joined us most recently in Munich for our special Munich Side Out episodes from the Munich Security Conference, and also on the very first episode of Berlin Side Out. She is the Senior Manager of Global Governmental Affairs at Bayer, a previous foreign policy advisor to the German Greens, and a member of the DGAP's action group Zeitenwende. Welcome back to the show to Britta Jakob.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
It is great to have you here. And also, from our very first episode, we welcome back Minna Ålander, who's not at home on Twitter. She's here with us in the studio today. Hello, Minna.
Yay, hello. Good to be back.
Minna, of course, is a research fellow at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, and you'll also remember her from our episode 11 on Northern Outlooks, how the Nordics see Germany and Germany sees the Nordics. But of course, Minna's also an expert on German security policy, having lived and worked here in Berlin for 10 years before her recent post back in Helsinki and on X.
Britta, when you were on with us on our very first episode, which we recorded 6 months ago, by the way, almost to the day, we asked what Germany's sea change in foreign policy or its Zeitenwende involves or should involve. And now we should ask the big question of whether it is in fact happening. On one hand, we see that Germany has said it will soon hit NATO's defense spending goal of 2% of GDP. But on the other hand, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has ruled out seizing frozen Russian assets to help fund Ukraine's victory or reconstruction. And of course, we just heard Anton Hofreiter and Thomas Erndl give a frank assessment of Olaf Scholz's refusal to send Taurus, and that he is risking European security. What do you think are the most important signposts that they left for us there?
Yeah, I think it was a really fair assessment regarding Chancellor Scholz's decision and statement on Taurus. And I also do think that it's really a historic failure that the Chancellor is making here. I think he's putting Germany and European security at risk and arguing with false reasons that are only excuses. And that is really something that is dangerous, also because he's not that kind of leader or showing the leadership that we need in a moment like this in Europe.
I think that it was a good summary of everything that has been said already about the Taurus decision. From a Stratcom perspective, it was obviously kind of devastating that this debate has been going on and going in circles for 8 or 9 months. That's a very long time. Already in the summer, the Chancellor was speaking about this geofencing opportunity, and then he didn't really comment on it or just said that it's not in question right now, and then waiting for such a long time and not even having a better explanation in the end is just a very weak response. I think that this shows that there has been very limited learning in the past 2 years in terms of how openly the Chancellor communicates his own sort of weak points and his own red lines and how to deter him. From the deterrence point of view, there's absolutely no strategic ambiguity with Scholz. He's very open about what deters him, and that has not changed essentially in the 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion.
Right, which is a remarkable gift to our enemies. And let's be clear, they are enemies, and thus they must be defeated, they must be deterred, but that's precisely what Scholz's approach is not helping us to do. So I wonder, Britta, Minna, have we really moved on in the last 2 years? Aren't we just in the same kind of geostrategic mess we were in 2 years ago?
I think we are, and I'm really sorry to be that pessimistic again, because I was very pessimistic in the first episode, and I really was hoping that maybe a year after that or half a year after that, we would be much more or better prepared and would have better reacted in a better way to the threat we are facing, but we are not. And I think there has been improvements in certain areas, but we shouldn't call that a Zeitenwende. And that is what is really critical. I think that Zeitenwende has become such an empty term for a policy without strategy. And not everything is a Zeitenwende only because we have improvements in certain political measures here.
Right, and when you're trying to plug a 450 billion euro hole with a 100 billion special fund, when you're not clear why Ukraine should win, when there's still big questions over your energy and economic dependencies, and you're not really in the position to actually strengthen the democratic world and its key institutions like NATO and the EU, as it was said would be a key element of the Zeitenwende, it's easy to understand your position from within Germany here, Britta. But how does it look outside, Minna?
This whole Taurus episode was a very good example of how Zeitenwende is in danger of becoming a typical German Selbstbeschäftigungsdebatte, which means that Germany is just sort of occupied with itself, and there's this danger of forgetting that none of this is about Germany, this is about Ukraine. Had Germany prioritized Ukraine over its own change and own troubles, it would have just delivered these missiles together with the Brits and the French. Nobody would even remember that at this point anymore if Germany had just done this like last summer. To be honest, I don't understand why Scholz chose this to be the hill to die on. It's a weird pick, in my opinion. But I think that it is very indicative of that there is this tendency in Germany to forget that this is essentially not about Germany. Finland and Sweden, for example, went through a much bigger Zeitenwende. That's where it really happened. What Germany needs to do, like without appreciating the challenges that Germany is facing and the changes needed to tackle those, it's still mostly things that can be solved with money and some political will. Whereas Finland and Sweden are looking at a really historical decision to join a military alliance, and that's a huge doctrinal and mental change in these two countries. And I don't think that this is fully appreciated in Germany, that Germany is not the only one going through stuff.
Even if he would argue it from a German or Germany perspective only, it would also be okay. I mean, it's not about charity to Ukraine. You can argue it's about Germany's security and freedom and stability, and that is why we do it. So I think it's not so much a matter of, is it about Ukraine, is it about Germany, but what is at stake as a whole. But for that, you need to explain things and you need to have a strategic vision of where to go. So actually, I think people don't buy what you do exactly, but why you do it. And this why is really, really missing in Scholz's statements.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and this explanation that actually Ukraine is the vector through which we improve our security, through which we ensure our democracies and the future of our free societies, that case hasn't been made very well. I mean, there have been exceptions, Aaron, as you know. Myself and Tony Hofreiter and Roderick Kiesewetter made this argument in a piece that appeared last week, among others who've been making that case. But Minna, I found it very interesting when you said there are problems that are fixable with a bit of money and a bit of political will. Now, around Europe, when the Germans claim to have no money, everybody laughs and says, come on, don't be silly. When the Germans claim not to have political will, there might be a slightly more understanding that indeed that is the case.
Britta, you made this point on our first episode where we would already have a Zeitenwende if Germany, in fact, simply delivered on the things that it had already promised. That would already be a change, and that would already be well appreciated by our allies, and that would already be a positive contribution to European security. So my question is, I mean, how much political will do you need to find to basically do things that you have already, in fact, promised to do?
Right. And Britta, in our first episode, you also laid out quite clearly what those things were. Where do we stand on those promises?
There was political will when he gave that speech in summing up, okay, there has been this shock, basically, right, by Russian invasion of Ukraine. And these are the things that we now have to turn to, and we really have to act. So I think at that point, there might have been political will. But then it got, lost on the way, or I think you have to ask that question to the Chancellery, basically. But it's clear that Scholz, especially, and the Chancellery, is clearly lacking the sense of urgency, of ambition, of willingness to pragmatic solutions also. Because there would be a way if there would be, if there were the will to act, and there's not. And I think what is maybe helpful is if we look at it, if we want to take stock of 2 years of Zeitenwende. So we should look at the question of to what extent has this shock of Russia's invasion led to reaction, to action, and or to readiness, including strategic foresight by the German government. And there we see, if we look at different areas, some reaction to some points, some actions, but do we see real readiness and foresight? And I don't think we do. And I think the most progress we can see in energy policy, really. But there again, I wouldn't call it a Zeitenwende, but more the plans that have been there anyway. But for example, there was a huge progress on getting rid of Russian oil and gas. We have an expansion of renewable energies, which is remarkable, really, if we look at the numbers. But then again, these other areas, like, for example, defense, or also what is happening when we look at economic or industrial policy. All these things really lack a clear plan and vision of where we want to go in Germany and Europe.
Right. I mean, Minna, this is part of the point. Sweden and Finland reacted to the situation that was forced on them. And this very much also the Scholz Chancellery was in those early period after the Russian full-scale invasion, reacting. This was a Zeitenwende that was forced on them. This was a change of times forced on by others. But what we've not seen is a transition to being able to change the times. We've talked a lot in the action group Zeitenwende about being subjects of this as well as objects. So actually it's a process you do. But I think this is where we're really falling short, isn't it? That we're not actually trying to make the weather. We're not trying to carry this forward.
It depends a bit which countries you're talking about and what is the time period that we look at. I would say that one reason why, especially Finland, but then also Sweden, were able to react so quickly and draw such swift conclusions from this dramatically changed situation was that there had been a lot of and long-term preparation ahead of that. So both countries had been already working towards a closest possible partnership with NATO so that they would be fully interoperable and compatible with NATO standards in every way, so that at least on Finland and Sweden's part, it wouldn't require anymore some kind of map process or other adaptation, and that it would be a short process on the Finnish and Swedish side. And this was a process that was kicked off or accelerated, especially in Finland, but also in Sweden in 2014 already. So there was this whole preparation, and this is also why it's so important what you just said, Britta, about the foresight, that what I think that is maybe happening in Germany, and which is a positive sign of change, is that there is maybe more thinking about worst case scenarios now, or it's more okay to talk about worst case scenarios in German public debate even. That used to be very much a taboo, and there used to be this thinking in Germany that you're going to kind of you're going to make it happen if you prepare for the worst. And
self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, exactly. And Finland is kind of the opposite, that we think that if you are well prepared, then there will be no surprises. And then you know how to react. And I think this is maybe changing a little bit. There is this realization in Germany that Germany also needs to prepare for the worst, so that it won't be another such a huge surprise as this invasion was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting observation that holds true for some parts of the government, some parts of the policy shaping community, but it's not true in the Chancellery. That's still, fingers crossed, foreign policy.
Actually, Scholz has been remarkably consistent throughout the, let's say, Zeitenwende, or since Russia invaded Ukraine.
The tide may be changing, but Scholz is not.
I mean, in the sense that he has articulated from the very first Spiegel interview in April 2022, where he first said that we can't do anything that risks a third world war, which would be a nuclear war. So he has been very consistent about, and he has been consistently avoiding some things, like talking about Ukrainian victory, and on the other hand, also very consistently saying that he will not do anything that risks a NATO-Russia war. So also the Taurus decision was entirely in line with that. I think that's the lawyer speaking in Scholz, that he's looking for these some clear-cut lines that would help orient it in this situation.
Minna, I found it interesting what you actually said recently about a couple of things. First of all, that the process of seeing whether Zeitenwende is happening in Germany is a bit of a Selbstbeschäftigungsdebatte. So great little word about how we're sort of self-obsessed or having our own little debate, which is not always necessarily keeping in mind what is actually happening outside. This comes back to our very first episode that you were on with Roderick Parks, where he actually mentioned that Germany has measured so much of its success by a willingness to break national taboos. And you've mentioned just then that there are a lot of national taboos that have been broken throughout the whole Zeitenwende debate of the last 2 years. I think that's interesting in my view. I think that we see that far more among the public, and we certainly see that far more among certain sections of Germany's elites and in the Bundestag. But as Ben was just mentioning, we're not seeing that in the Chancellery with Olaf Scholz. And this is not, I would say, any more something that's just embarrassing for us in Germany, although it still is that. Ben and I, you and I have both written recently about how this is actually dangerous and that it's risking our own security.
Right, and I mean, that draws a lot on what Minna was saying a second ago, and what we also heard in the Nordics episode too, that there was a reactive part to the change that went on in terms of joining NATO and so on, but there was also more of a proactive part of that change in terms of understanding what the systemic competition is, understanding that this is a contest between democracies and autocracies. And we heard that for Sweden from Anna Wieslander, as well as to an extent Minna from you. And that's the change that we haven't heard in the Chancellery. And this piece that we wrote basically outlined 4 reasons why we think Germany is sleepwalking into a perfect storm, and then gave 5 things that Germany could do about it, and which ideally the Chancellor would sign off on straight away in order to actually get us out of this extremely dangerous situation. So what are the 4 interconnected reasons that we see this perfect security storm brewing? The first is the way we're allowing the war in Ukraine to play out. Kiev's not yet losing, but it's no longer winning. And we have to face the very real possibility that the worst case scenario this year for Ukraine is no longer stalemate, it is defeat, unless we provide Ukraine very quickly with what it needs to move to active defense. And you'll find in the show notes a link to some very good articles on that from both Jack Watling of RUSI and Major General Mick Ryan, who've both recently written on this. Second is Europe's glaring capability lacks. We lack the breadth of equipment and the depth of munition to fight a high-intensity, peer-to-peer, state-to-state conflict for any amount of time. At the moment, our response is primarily geared around the United States, being able to quickly supply Europe and quickly put capabilities into Europe to support a war-fighting effort. The European militaries, with some notable exceptions, and I see Minna looking at me here, but with some notable exceptions, most European militaries are still geared to fighting the scheduled wars of choice that we had over the last 20 years or so, these expeditionary wars where by dint of our technological superiority, we didn't expend so much ammunition and we didn't lose much kit to attrition from the other side. As we've seen in Ukraine, that's not something that would happen in a state-to-state conflict. So we need a lot more equipment and we need a lot more manpower and we need the key enablers, the logistics, the command and control, etc., to actually manage those, plus other key enablers as well. And we're missing a lot of that kit in Europe. It was Mike Kaufman who said in Helsinki a little while ago when we were both at a conference there that European air forces are really good. They could beat the Russian air force any day of the week as long as they didn't have to do it next week as well, because they would have run out of ammunition by that time. We lack that depth of munitions. Now we're trying to build that up, but it's not happening fast enough. Third reason is the uncertainty over the US security guarantee going forward. And this is what has really, I think, lit the fire under the changes that we're starting to see in the rhetoric, at least, that's coming out of European leaders at the moment. The rhetoric that came out of the Elysee Palace this week from Macron and others, because there is that big uncertainty as to what would happen if Donald Trump gets elected. Can we rely on Article 5? And if we can't, we know we are not at the moment prepared to fight that war on our own. So we've got to get quickly prepared in time to be able to defeat Russia and to be able to credibly deter Russia in the time it would take Russia to get its own capabilities ready after the end of hostilities in Ukraine. And fourth is that we are signaling weakness rather than resolve. And as Anton Hofreiter rightly said earlier, where Putin is very skilled at exploiting weakness and exploiting uncertainty, especially when he detects weakness. And so in not seizing Russian assets, in failing to give Ukraine what it needs to win, in not ramping up our defense industrial production, in not even saying Ukraine should win. And so clearly not standing up for what is very clearly in our own interests, we are signaling that weakness. And it's that battle of resolve that is key, as well as the battle of forces to this equation. So that's why we think that this is leading to trouble. What could Germany and others do to get out of this? First, give Ukraine what it needs to move to active defense. And we've seen the Danish Prime Minister set a great example of this, saying, look, we all have more we could give. Give it now, for goodness sakes. This is the priority. And it's interesting to note this point about ammunition production, that 40% of shells produced in the EU are still going outside of the EU and not to Ukraine. That surely has to be reprioritized. Giving things like Taurus immediately would make that massive difference as well. Second, show the political will to seize the Russian assets. And Aaron, you've written on this just this week with the MacDonald-Laurier Institute, and you can find that paper in the show notes as well. But to really demonstrate again, we're willing to do what it takes to win, and we're not going to let Russia get away with this. The aggressor must pay. Third, we need to have this long-term vision for the European security architecture, which means actually including Ukraine in NATO or in a framework of security guarantees provided by European states. To get Ukraine into NATO, we would need to engage in proper burden shifting, not just burden sharing. And again, that means stepping up our capabilities. So fourth is really ramping up our defense industrial production. We've seen this start to happen in the Nordics. We've seen it start to happen sporadically around Europe, but it really needs to get closer to wartime economy production. And fifth, the easiest to achieve, but with probably the greatest short-term impact and the greatest agenda-setting power, would be simply to say Ukraine must win. And that's not something that Olaf Scholz has yet done. The goal defines the means, and if you set that as the goal, the state will have to find the means to deliver it. So that's what we see as the four reasons and the 5 things you can do about it.
First of all, let's go to that last recommendation, which is, as Ben has argued before, the most crucial one, which is saying that Ukraine should win. Olaf Scholz has not said this, but others have. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has also said this as well.
When Pistorius or Baerbock say that Ukraine needs to win, it's good PR, but it doesn't matter in the sense that they don't call the shots. There's a very clear hierarchy in the German government, and the Chancellor has the decision-making power in the end. If in doubt, he will decide also against advice or whatever anybody else is saying.
I think really he also doesn't maybe share the goal of Ukraine needs to win, and he doesn't want to really take decisive action, because if he said Ukraine should win, then he would have to take also the decisive action that you need to make this happen. So in a way, we just remain in that vicious circle, and maybe some members of the government and members of the parliament and the public, they get it, that this is what needs to be done, but the chancellor just doesn't want to make Ukraine win. That is at least the conclusion I come to.
I believe that he thinks that this long grinding war is still better than risking any kind of either horizontal or vertical escalation.
Exactly. And what you said about he's willing to give everything that Ukraine needs, well, I'm not really sure about this, because he has been hesitant.
To defend, the cities, that is purely kind of like to intercept like Russian missiles and so on, that doesn't go into Russian territory, that's what I mean.
That's true. But there again, he has been hesitant every step on the way. So it wasn't his call to say, okay, that's now what we do. We always had a debate, as you said before, about every single weapon system, and then huge debate, and then in the end it was like, yeah, well, okay, now we do it. But that's not the game changer. Every single time. The biggest problem that we have is his indecisiveness, or that he just simply has a different goal that we all have.
Right, and this is what needs to be explained clearly to the German public, I think. Your Chancellor does not want to win this war. And understanding why that is the case is essential for understanding Germany's strategy and then allowing people to evaluate that and seeing if they think that's in their interest. I think there was a very interesting piece in The Economist this week by Shash Joshi, listener to the show, we know, hi there, to you, which very clearly laid out why Ukraine must win. And The Economist has been one publication that's been absolutely consistent in this line, and it's based on analysis not only from their own excellent analysts and experts, but also from some of the leading think tanks, including from RUSI in London, who they talk to a lot. And I think what that piece lays out very clearly is there is no reason for Putin to stop at Ukraine if he were able to win there. This would embolden Russia. It would not deter Russia. But why would Putin do something as seemingly silly as to attack a NATO state? Well, if he felt he could get away with it, why not? Because the very existence of our states, our free societies as success stories is what threatens his model. Crushing that success story next door is essential to the continuity of the kind of world he wants to see.
And especially the existence of countries that he perceives as inferior, like the Baltic states, or I don't know, probably also the Visegrad countries and so on, like these countries that in Putin's opinion never were supposed to be independent of Russia from Moscow.
Right, and whose very impotence as small states to first of all exist, how dare they? Second of all, have ideas about how they might live. I mean, the cheek of that. Third, decide which alliances they might like to join, self-determination and so on. I mean, this is just rubbing a great power's face in it, isn't it? He cannot let that stand.
So this would have been actually the first thing I would say for the Chancellor to do is to really listen to your partners in the EU and NATO and listen to these smaller states and listen to their experiences and what they are threatened by and what their plans are. But that hasn't happened. So he remains in this kind of arrogant way of doing politics and then describing it as deliberate and planned and not risking Germany's security.
Precisely. I mean, this is something we've talked a lot on this show about the so-called neo-idealists and others who actually see the value of self-determination for democratic societies and who see our values as our long-term interests. And our colleague Leonie Stamm, I think, put it really well when she said our values have been marginalized interests. And they've been treated like that, and we need to move them back center stage. And by doing that, we would actually get a lot further towards preserving what we value about our way of life, and indeed seeing how we might shape a world that would be conducive to that. So a world not only safe for democracy, but in which free societies could thrive.
I was just in the US speaking at a conference, and we got a question about German democracy and Ukraine, and how these two things are linked, and what the US interest specifically was in that, because of course this was an American audience. And I simply said, well, it's very clear what all of our interests should be in Germany, in the US, on a Ukrainian victory. It is simply that the precedent of an authoritarian state being able to invade a democratic state and take it over is simply one that we cannot allow and would embolden other authoritarians. That resonated very well with that audience. That's clearly an argument that resonates with some of our allies in the Baltics and in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm not sure that that's one that we really see appropriately appreciated in Germany, and not just in the Chancellery. And when we have a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism here, as we have, we need to be able to do everything possible to win. However, at a recent EU summit of foreign ministers, we saw Estonia's Maga Sakna come and argue for the seizure of Russian assets, the $300 billion that are sitting in Western bank accounts that were frozen at the beginning of the war of Russian central bank assets. When Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, was asked the same question, whether she was in favor, she said, no, we have to adhere to international law when it comes to these assets. And I mean, that's something that seems very strange to me, because this is something that we can do as a countermeasure under international law to help Ukraine win, to help Ukraine defend itself. And it's something that in Germany, we're not willing to do yet. And unfortunately, some of that old thinking still is in places like the Foreign Ministry, not simply the Chancellery. So what do you think of this exactly?
Yeah, we'll give our green in the room a moment to breathe on that one. But when Aaron was talking about the stakes of this war not perhaps resonating in Germany, you were nodding along. Have Germans realized what's at stake here?
Some have. I think that Baerbock's statement here is a very typical German reaction. Germans tend to think very legalistically. It also explains this whole reasoning by Scholz in the Taurus question, like what would make, in legal terms, Germany potentially a party to this war. So no surprises there, but we'll see. But I just wanted to take up something that you mentioned, Britta, about that if the Chancellor had listened to partners and drawn the right conclusions from what they were telling, actually the more pressing problem here is that, so there was no shortage of consultations, and Germany has been very much engaged in all kinds of cooperation formats with the Baltic states, with Central and Eastern European countries and so on. But the problem has been with these that they have had absolutely zero policy impact in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, we hear what you're saying, we're just going to ignore you.
Exactly. This is the way. So and this goes back to this. So for Germany, cooperation is a value in itself. Other countries like Finland or France or others have a much more instrumentalist view of cooperation, that it's a means to an end, for example. But it's understandable in terms of German history. There is this idea that that Germany always has to cooperate with others, but then it's not always so clear in Germany what is the goal of that cooperation. There is not necessarily any kind of particular strategy behind the cooperation. It's just cooperation for the cooperation's sake. And then we have the situation where you do constantly consult and talk with partners, but it has no impact.
So interesting. I mean, yes, this confusion of process and outcome.
And when it comes to Central Eastern Europe, we've talked about it, so it's all fine. We're going to ignore you, despite the fact that you've been right all along anyway.
Right, and this points to that wider problem that some of the neo-idealists have got to, and Sarkinen would be a good example of this, of looking at how our institutions and our processes of cooperation are not fit for purpose, and how actually the institutions and this focus on process is a structurally entrenched way to admire the problem without actually doing much about it. So I think that's something that we could come back to. But Britta, we're not going to let you off the hook with this one entirely. What's going on there with the Greens and the unwillingness to pursue all the measures we could possibly take, even when others are showing there are legal ways to do this?
Yeah, well, I can certainly not speak for the Green foreign minister here, which is clear. But what I do see as well, and I agree with what you have said, that actually it's this, well, good that we talked about it, good that we had this really great debate. Bye, have a great day, and now we just do our thing. And I think the main problem there is also that German leadership still, or because it hasn't really been forced to do it, is not willing to really take a risk. So basically, we only look into these things in, okay, what is compliant with law, with international law, this legalistic debate, as you said, and we have that in this debate about seizing Russian assets, but also when it comes to Ukrainian NATO membership as well. So there's all these processes, all these legalistic aspects always that come first and not really serve the cause of what is needed or our outcome. So that is in a way this, how do I put it, like this cozy situation that you're then in because you have all these legalistic aspects around you and basically giving you in a way security of
like
what,
a sense of certainty,
certainty of what decision to take.
The
right?
restrictive comfort of legalism.
Yes, in a way that it is, and also when. In our discussion on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference with the Lithuania's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, on Lithuania's stance on Taiwan and opening up the Taiwan representation in the country, I remember very well that he answered on this question, but how did you explain this to your people? Wasn't that difficult also to say, well, we take this pressure from China and we go this way anyway? And he responded, of course it's difficult, of course it's hard, but that's my job. I stand there and I explain to the people why it's the right thing to do. And this is not at all something that we incorporated here in Germany.
Indeed, it's not a risk if you explain it like that and saying, yes, there are costs, but also it's in our interest. So I think that the restrictive comfort of legalism is one thing. The lack of willingness to take a risk is another thing, even if that actually puts you at greater risk in the long run, which is something that Green politicians have talked about in the past, that there's a risk to inaction, and even Annalena Baerbock has talked about this. So I think we're back to a situation then of the coalition parties within Germany legitimating policies that they don't end up agreeing with.
Mm. What exactly should Scholz's coalition partners be thinking right now? I mean, it's we have a historically unpopular government. A recent poll indicates that only 18% of Germans are satisfied with its work. 46% say they are very dissatisfied with its work, and another 34% say they are somewhat dissatisfied. And at the same time, if we think of Scholz's coalition partners, the Greens and the Liberal Free Democrats, to Scholz's Social Democrats, of course, is it time for them to be asking what they're getting out of this coalition? We know that many of his partners are pro-Taurus, want to deliver it, want to step up ammunition production, even want to seize Russian assets. We've heard Sebastian Schäfer, budget spokesperson for the Greens in Parliament, called for this. How long is this sustainable when you're a part of a historically unpopular government not getting the kinds of things that you want out of the coalition anyway?
So if you ask how long this coalition is going to tolerate this and go on, well, until the next elections, most likely. It's Germany after all. Governments don't just fall here. There's an extreme aversion to any kind of destabilizing moves like that, and it would be probably even more devastating for the parties who are already struggling. I mean, FDP, the Liberals at this moment probably wouldn't even make the 5% hurdle into the parliament, which is like pretty devastating. So they have high stakes here, and it has been clear from the beginning that after such a long time in the opposition for both parties, they will not topple this government. They will stick with it until the bitter end. I don't think we're going to see anything dramatic happening here.
No, indeed. But, I mean, Britta, the Greens had quite some success early on in the coalition. They made a couple of key achievements on renewables, they did help move the dial on German foreign and security policy, it must be said. And they got achievements such as the Deutschland ticket and so on transport. But in order to justify to the membership, in order to justify to the parliamentarians, some more achievements need to come. So what would be the kind of positive program that the Greens could outline for the remaining legislative period?
I think for them it's really important to stick to their energy agenda and the green transition agenda, because that is basically what is also expected from the Greens and the coalition, right? I mean, there have been huge expectations, and I think they really also delivered on certain aspects. As I said, renewables, for example, or also CO2 emissions that decreased to the lowest point since 1950, for example. So all of these things that have been not really managed well before, there has been really progress and early on, as you said. So I think you have to really go through or follow this path that we have to make Germany fit for this green energy transition. And that is really where the Greens are needed, I think, but also to combine it with the social agenda, because also in linking it to the AfD and their rising strength now in the polls, we see a lot of concern in the broader public also against right-wing populism and extremism. So I think it's really crucial to be a party in this coalition that pushes for progress on the social angle, but also on strengthening democracy, on basically offering an agenda for a better tomorrow, also an agenda for future generations. And I'm not sure really who would it be so much if now all the whole coalition would be blown up, and then we have CDU, CSU, as Tony Hofreiter said before, that is also divided. We have AfD just waiting there. We have FDP that might not be part of the next Bundestag. So this situation is really difficult, and I think that is also something that is of very much of a concern to the Greens now deciding, should we stay, should we leave? And there's still a lot to achieve.
Yes, I mean, there's responsibility that comes into that for a stable government, for the country and so on. But surely all of those plans are grounded on security. And without the provision of security as the irreducible function of the state, then the Greens or anyone else will struggle to implement them.
Can I actually add a silver lining on this? Because there has been a lot of this assumption around in Germany that the German population is not ready for higher defense spending and that they will not support it in the long term, and that any government will face this problem of losing popular support sooner or later. Well, actually, there won't necessarily have to be this kind of kindergarten or Panzerwagen debate, I think, because the latest Politbarometer poll from this month indicated that 72% of the respondents were in support of higher defense spending, even if it means cuts in other fields.
So Panzergarten for alle.
Exactly. So there might be like this might indicate the beginning of understanding that maybe the tanks are like unfortunately a precondition of having kindergarten. You have to be alive after all, and I think this is a positive sign, because if you compare it to older politbarometers, for example, last year in April it was 59% who thought so. So this number has actually gone up. So the government could actually have a mandate for this if they decided to use it.
Yeah, that's right. And the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung survey, which you can also find in our show notes, released just last week, shows very similar things, that there is a continued majority for further defense spending in Germany, even beyond what has been given with the Sondervermögen special fund of 100 billion euros. So yes, you have to be alive, and you also have to be able to determine the kind of society that you want. Yes. And that's, I think, the connection that we mentioned before that's not being made between these different issues. So I wonder also, Britta, hearing from Tony Hofreiter earlier, there are things that the Greens could also further push on the security agenda, and the FDP. And we also talked with quite a few FDP people in Munich and elsewhere, and they're keen, I think, to push the security agenda forward. Given the way things have gone with Taurus, and given the hard negotiations there were over the missile that could not be named in that Bundestag motion, it was Taurus.
The Voldemort of missiles.
That's right, which put Defense Minister Pistorius in that ridiculous situation of not being able to say whether it was or not included. Given that the difficulties we had over that, finding some concrete steps to be able to take that could clearly be pushed, such as reprioritizing the ammunition, such as seizing Russian assets, for example, would be perhaps ways that could be gone.
I don't know that the Liberals are going to be any help here, because Lindner, the finance minister, is so dead set on the debt brake, and he is not moving on this issue. So he seems just as stubborn as the chancellor with regard to this like core policy issue for his party. It's not getting him anywhere, but here we are.
We heard an interesting argument about that in Munich, actually, from a liberal politician who's very committed to defense, very committed to Ukraine. And the concern was that if the debt brake is removed, the extra spending wouldn't go for defense and it wouldn't go for Ukraine. It would go to social programs and environmental programs. And actually having the argument about the necessity of those seems to be the key issue, rather than about the debt brake itself. You could argue that, as we have on this show before, that the debt brake is a fiscally self-imposed wound, that is an act of recklessness, in fact, in a time of great need. The workaround that the German government found of all these special funds, which has now been shut down, closed the avenue for flexibility. So it seems as though there's a need for a bit more flexibility, at least, to be injected there. But the discussion around political prioritization of those various issues continues and reflects the diversity of German parties, it must be said, which is a sign of actually health of democracy, I would say.
In part because of the debt brake, I think this is actually why in Germany, it is necessary for us to look at something like seizing these frozen assets of the Russian central bank. Now, we shouldn't use that as a way to duck the debt brake discussion, or as a way to simply say that we should use that exclusively to support Ukraine and not continue to make the case to our taxpayers of why this is necessary for us to keep supporting Ukraine on top of seizing these assets. But the reality is that we have this debt brake. We also have funding for Ukraine tied up in U.S. Congress for a long time. So I think it's ever more pressing for us to have this discussion about seizing the frozen Russian assets. The Russians cannot access these assets, but we have not taken them to be able to fund Ukraine's liberation and its reconstruction. And based on the financial pressures, including, I think you, Ben and I, you would argue artificial ones of this debt brake, but nonetheless financial pressures that exist at the moment and that aren't going away, it's ever so necessary for us to take these assets to help alleviate some of that. But Germany is one of the countries that so far is very against this, along with France, Belgium, other EU partners, where a lot of these assets are, even if the US, the UK, and Canada at the moment are in favor of seizing these assets.
Right, Aaron, and I think you argued very well in that piece for the MLI that it's disrespectful to our taxpayers to actually tell them, we have to win this war, here's all the burden on you, when we could actually make the aggressor pay and pay up front. So it seems that we, of course, should contribute to this because it's in our security interest, but we can also make Russia pay. I think it's also been interesting to see Janet Yellen from the US calling for this, calling for us to move forward on that. Now, the US calling for something that is on the edges of international law may not convince many Germans, but Canada, I mean, Canada, surely must be the example that even Germans could look to and say they're a good, law-abiding, solid citizen of the international community, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the argument that I made there. This is something that Canada needs to do. It sort of needs to realize that it has to step up and that it has to that it has to take a lead on a file like this one. The Zeitenwende should not just be about Germany either. It should also be about other countries, including, my other country, stepping up to the plate as well. But we do hear that from supportive members of the German Bundestag and others that actually a law from Canada would help them make the case. Britta and Minna, what are you looking out for over the next few months in German foreign policy in tandem with us going through season 2 on BerlinsideOut? What are the real big things that you're watching for?
Yes, in German foreign policy, apart from the second season of BerlinsideOut, what are the main themes?
Indeed.
Well, I think it's really critical to keep up the pressure on German government, and that is what Thomas Erndl just referred to, that they would do, and I think that's a good thing. The government needs to explain what is at stake here for Germany and Europe and come up with a clear strategy on how we want to defend our security and freedom in Europe. And for that, we need to give everything to Ukraine that it needs to win the war to deter Russia. But also, I think it's crucial to take the systemic rivalry between autocracies and democracies really seriously and come up with an economic and industrial policy also that is fit for this rivalry and that secures our prosperity. So that means a clear de-risking strategy, improve investment environment, completing our common European market, and also helping businesses to get access to alternative markets, because it has been started a little bit with the economic security strategy and national security strategy that is talking about de-risking, but there's still not really a clear strategy of where does the government want to go, and there's not a real team play between businesses and politics, and I think that is very much needed. And the last point I wanted to make is also a vision for Europe again, because I think we don't have any discussion anymore of who we want to be, where we want to go as a strong and resilient and prosperous Europe. We have a few debates, yes, about enlargement and the processes, but also, I mean, there are so many questions that play a role here. How to deal with or stabilize Western Balkans? How do we engage with Central Asia? So basically, what is Europe's role in the world?
So all of that really does indeed speak to not just accepting the Zeitenwende as something, again, that happens to us, but getting out there and shaping the times that we live in and shaping the times in the world that we want to live in, coherently putting that together under a strategic umbrella and with a thoroughgoing perspective that could make complementary rather than contradictory policy across these different areas. And if I'm right with my suspicion, by de-risking, you didn't necessarily mean more exposure to China rather than less.
Exactly.
As the Mercedes-Benz CEO said recently.
Minna.
I think one really big challenge for this German government in the remaining term in office will be the US question, because Scholz has relied so heavily on the Biden administration in every new step that he has taken in terms of supporting Ukraine. So I hope that in the Chancellery they are going through some worst case scenarios and figuring out already now how they are willing to react. This is not necessarily just a Scholz and Germany problem, but probably partly also a Biden/Sullivan problem, that they have been sort of operating based on the wrong escalation risk analysis. So they are obviously trying to prevent this kind of Big Bang, doomsday, nuclear escalation here. But what we are actually seeing is this kind of more gradual escalation constantly, by not only Russia, but China, Iran, North Korea, who have now teamed up and are working together in this kind of, maybe it's just an alliance of convenience, but it's working well enough. Russia has been much better able to replenish its stocks and get its war machine up and running than we had hoped. I think the Chancellery should broaden their understanding what escalation means here and how do you have to react to that. This gradual approach is probably the wrong one because these rogue actors are watching how the West is reacting and they are drawing their conclusions. And right now it looks like you can get away with quite a lot if you have nuclear weapons.
This is the point. Weakness in itself is escalatory.
Yeah, you end up with putting us at much greater risk. You end up with us being a much greater threat, this creeping escalation of threat.
Exactly. It may not be this kind of Big Bang Third World War that ends in a nuclear Armageddon, but what we're already seeing is conflicts erupting in different parts of the world. So we might see more of an era of world wars, maybe with small W's.
And this chaos coalition that you mentioned, who are destructive actors in the world, but nonetheless have got their act together.
They're seizing the opportunity.
They're seizing the opportunity and stretching our bandwidth for decision-making, but also by exactly what Aaron mentioned, this weakness that we show, we limit our own possibility to shape the world that we actually live in and to actually harness our ordering power. So we end up with a real problem there. And one thing I often think of when you referred to the reliance on the US, the hiding behind Biden phenomenon that we see here, it might look ostensibly like this is a good allied move from Germany to be in lockstep with the US on Ukraine, even if they're very much out of step on some other issues, which doesn't get as much coverage. But Germany's not the US. Germany doesn't have the US's oceans. It doesn't have the US's nuclear weapons. It is much more directly and much more drastically exposed to as a threat that would come from a victorious Russia than the US is.
And Germany needs its own long-term strategy here because there is an increasing question mark on the United States commitment, unfortunately.
That's exactly right. And luckily enough, dear listeners, that's the subject of our next episode, moving from Zeitenwende to grand strategy. Well done, Minna. beers for you later. Indeed. So that's going to be our second episode. We're actually going to talk about this move that has come out of the conclusions of the action group Zeitenwende so far, to talk about how Germany might develop a grand strategy, why that has been such a controversial topic here in Germany. And then, Aaron, we move on to who should be the targets of those strategies, don't we?
Indeed, we do. So let's just chat about season 2 to give you a bit of a taste. We'll start with that grand strategy discussion. You'll remember from our first season, we looked at several key themes that we need to see changes in Germany for Zeitenwende to be successful. We've talked about that here on this episode, our stance on Ukrainian victory, defense kit, as Britta just said, our economic and trade model, our energy mix. But we also looked at in season 1 with our relationships with key allies. This season, as Ben said, we'll be looking at our more adversarial relationships, the targets of those strategies with the world's two big authoritarians, Russia and China. But as we've said, first, we'll start with that grand strategy to really lay out all of these things and how they're linked. And that's a strategic sort of approach that we need to see more of in Germany in general.
We do, in order to manage escalation, among other things, and to understand where are opportunities for action, for achieving the kind of vision that would underpin such a grand strategy and the threats to it and how we counteract them. So we're going to be talking deterrence, escalation, nuclear and other weapons with a host of experts as well. And we'll be talking Ukraine, of course, as the route to strategic success for Europe at the moment, at least, certainly runs through Ukraine. So we have a lot to look forward to on season 2, and we're looking forward to sharing that with you with a raft of excellent guests that we have coming. So with that said, big thank you to Britta Jakob and Minna Ålander, friends of the show, friends of us as well, for joining us for this great discussion on where Germany lies this 6 months into BerlinsideOut and 2 years into the Zeitenwende. We continue to push for the real Zeitenwende that we need.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Indeed, thank you very much for joining us on our Season 2 kickoff, Britta and Minna. Thank you also to our special guests, Anton Hofreiter and Thomas Erndl, as well as to our project assistants, Jannik Hartmann and Julian Stuckle, and the DGAP team. We hope you'll continue to join us this Season 2. For now, though, from Berlin, danke, kiitos, servus, and goodbye.